is Teddy, and after a significant period of observation and experimentation, I've come to the conclusion that Teddy is indeed a sentient organism. So according to what we've posited so far, that should mean that Teddy has free will. So does Teddy have free will? Well, he needs to be able to desire things in order to have a will. And Teddy desires many things. He desires food, he desires belly rubs often, but more than anything, this dog desires to lick my face. He's been like this ever since he was a puppy, just surging with that insatiable desire to lick faces. But in this video, I want to show that on average, Teddy doesn't have as much free will as I do. Because in the last video, we posited that free will is context dependent, varying based on the feasibility and constraints of what one desires in a given context. The idea of free will in general, devoid of any context, doesn't really make any sense. It depends on what we're willing. So, with that in mind, Teddy, can you use your free will to prove that there's an infinite number of prime numbers? No? You can't? Pathetic. I can. It's not only that Teddy can't do this, it's that his mind completely lacks the capacity to comprehend what that even means. It's utterly foreign to his mind. And this is because Teddy lacks consciousness. Now, to be clear, there are probably some things for which Teddy has more free will than I do. For example, he probably is more proficient at tracking down and hunting rabbits than I am. But my consciousness greatly expands that which I have free will over compared to Teddy. Now, by consciousness, I don't mean any kind of mental experience. That's what we're calling sentience. By consciousness, I specifically mean that feature of human cognition which, amongst other things, allows us to understand the meaning of words, to know things explicitly, to generate predictive models that allow us to make predictions about what's going to happen in the future, and to be aware of things even if we're not directly perceiving them. For example, does Teddy know what country he's in right now? Does he know what month it is? Does he even know how old he is? He's 3, by the way. But notice how all of these facts are totally absent from his mind. It's not just that he doesn't know them, he doesn't even have the cognitive architecture necessary to be able to know them. And most animals probably also don't have this feature of their minds, because if they did, they would be exhibiting completely different behavior. So it's this capacity to be aware of things in that sense, explicitly, that we're calling consciousness. It's not merely intuitive knowing, but knowing as though the object of what you were knowing was the focus of your attention. It was in the center of your mind. Consciousness is a form of sentience. You might even describe it as an emergent phenomenon from sentience, the same way sentience is an emergent phenomenon from matter. And in this video, I'm going to explain why consciousness gives us much more free will and actually raises our free will to an unprecedented level. This fact is responsible for why humans have been able to accomplish so much as a species, why we have so much more power over other organisms, and why we're able to influence our environments to such a profound degree. And it's also given us the ability to, in many ways, transcend our biological limitations. And it will continue to increase as our consciousness of the world expands. So the reason I can prove that there's an infinite number of prime numbers, whereas Teddy can't, is because I learned Euclid's proof from Wikipedia page. Now, it's not nearly as impressive as coming up with the original proof as Euclid did, but through Euclid's use of rigorous logic and mathematical reasoning, he was able to show that there's an infinite number of prime numbers, and so humanity has become conscious of this fact. What does being conscious of that fact actually give us? Well, it's an important idea in cybersecurity for one thing, but it's also a very important fundamental truth upon which we can build deeper mathematical truths. But to strike more deeply at the core of the matter, I'm going to consider another thing of which we're conscious. Imagine it's the Napoleonic Wars and you're a Prussian soldier fighting against the French, bravo, when all of a sudden you're shot in the abdomen, leaving a musket ball implanted in your flesh. You're carried to the doctor, and he begins to rifle through his unsanitized surgery equipment, and with his unwashed hands begins to perform surgery in order to get the musket ball out. Now, the musket itself probably wasn't enough to kill you, but you are almost certainly going to die an excruciating death from the subsequent infection. Because this would have been before we were conscious of the existence of microorganisms. It was only many decades later that we learned about the existence of bacteria and understood that they were responsible for infections. And so previously you would have been fated to die a terrible death as bacteria consumed your rotting flesh from the inside. But because we're conscious of microorganisms, we now have power over this, and surgeons now know to wash their hands and sanitize their equipment. Simply being conscious of the existence of microorganisms has effectively altered the destiny of mankind, such that these days thousands of surgeries are performed every single day, and you can reasonably expect to survive. And knowledge in this field has given us the means to cure so many diseases. It's allowed us, for one, to develop antibiotics, but it's also given us the simple fact that washing your hands is a good way to prevent many illnesses. We've also invented refrigerators for the purpose of slowing down bacterial growth in our food, and we have the idea of expired food so that we don't eat food when it's contaminated with bacteria. All of this is possible because of our consciousness of the fact that microorganisms exist, which again, we didn't know for a significant period of history. But staying on the topic of bacteria, did you know that the bacteria in your gut can influence your mood? So for example, if you eat a lot of processed sugars, there's a good chance that the bacteria in your gut have adapted to consume sugars. And when they detect an absence of sugars, they release hormones into your bloodstream, which cause you to crave sugar. In fact, one of the ways that might do this is to actually lower your mood so that you feel kind of terrible, and then that might motivate you to take something sugary in order to feel better. And this is one of the reasons why people may develop cravings for food that aren't necessarily good for them. Now, you might be thinking that this proves that free will doesn't exist, right? Because it's not you that's choosing to get the sugar, it's the bacteria that are kind of controlling you and controlling your urges. But a more subtle examination of this reveals that this isn't exactly the case. Because you may think that this shows that what you do is ultimately determined by material causation. So the bacteria for one thing, but also the hormones that they release. These are what are causing you to act in a certain way. And their effect upon your mood is something that's out of your control. But if you think about how this works, it isn't as though the bacteria release hormones into your bloodstream and then puppeteer your body to go and get sugar. Instead, the bacteria operate by trying to influence your mood. Its effects upon your psyche is what's driving you to seek what you seek. It doesn't move your body the way I can just pick up Teddy and force him to move however I want. It has to have an influence on your psyche. And then it's your psyche which decides to go get sugar. It's not the bacteria, it's your psychic state that's capable of grabbing your body and moving it to wherever it wants in order to satisfy its desires. Yes, it's true that the state of your psyche is being influenced by things which you don't have control over, but it's the psyche itself which has free will. It's the thing that decides ultimately whether you have sugar or not. And we know this because you don't necessarily have to respond to those feelings by eating sugar. You can get your hit of dopamine elsewhere. Because ultimately, it's the psyche that chooses how to respond to those feelings. In other words, the psyche is the entity that really has power here because it has the final say. And you can still show that a person has free will even over the bacteria in their body. Because let's say, for example, that you do have this hardwired craving for sugar being driven by your gut bacteria, but you've decided to reduce your sugar consumption for health reasons. So you can think of that as a new desire which you've integrated into your psyche such that it's now a part of you. It's one of your moral beliefs, so to speak. Now, they may have originated from something external, such as your doctor giving you a recommendation, but it has entered your psyche such that it is now a part of yourself. So now imagine that you're on this new diet when all of a sudden that craving hits you, that strong desire for sugar really grips you. So what's happening at a psychological level is one part of your psyche is trying to get you to go get sugar, whereas another part, which is arguably weaker, is trying to get you to follow your higher principles. When you're in this conflicted state, notice how there are two parts of your psyche and they're pulling in opposite directions and they're trying to each get something which the other is trying to inhibit. And so they represent barriers to each other. And remember, free will is all about overcoming barriers. So a part of your own psyche can be a barrier to another part of your psyche. Your natural craving has to somehow impede that part of yourself, which has chosen a higher path, so to speak. And that higher path, that part of you that's more associated with your moral beliefs, has to overcome your lower instincts that are really trying to force you to do something which you've chosen not to do. But what's rather clear is that even though you feel that craving, you don't have to give into it. Yes, your psyche is trying to get you to eat sugar, but you don't have to obey it. This might be very difficult to do, but if you're conscious and mindful of your cravings, and you're aware of the fact that you're going to have cravings, that gives you some power over them. Because you can realize and think to yourself, okay, well, my body right now is trying to get me to eat sugar, but I just have to be aware of that feeling and ignore it. Or find a more useful and healthy strategy for dealing with those feelings. But there are even more profound ways where more consciousness can actually make your goal of quitting sugar more likely. Because if you're conscious of the fact that there are gut bacteria in your body trying to influence you, it means that you have power over them because you can affect your gut bacteria in such a way that it serves your higher interests. So for example, you can eliminate the bacteria in your gut and replace them with healthier bacteria. And you can do this by drinking Lysol. No, I'm kidding, don't do that. There are way safer ways to replace the bacteria in your gut besides drinking Lysol, such as by taking probiotics, for example. And doing so eliminates a significant barrier to you quitting sugar. And so this example shows that if you're conscious of certain facts, your power over the world has increased substantially. So my point is that something which on the surface seems to be beyond your control is actually controllable if you possess consciousness about it. Consciousness gives you more free will. And I want you to notice the subtle distinction between consciousness and perception, because we've already discussed how perception can give you free will, but consciousness is slightly different because you don't necessarily have to perceive that which you're conscious of in order to be conscious of it. For example, you've never perceived your own gut bacteria unless you've taken your own stool sample and examined it under a microscope, and you do you, but most of us haven't actually done this, and so you never actually perceived your gut bacteria, but you are conscious of their existence. Or at least now you're conscious of their existence after watching this video. So you don't actually have to perceive something in order to be conscious of it. And the enormous power of consciousness starts to become even more clear when you think about some of the amazing accomplishments which the human species has achieved, all thanks to our higher consciousness. Take, for example, the fact that humans have been to the moon. That is utterly remarkable because for most of human history, we never envisioned the possibility of actually leaving the surface of the planet. It just seemed flat out impossible. That is, until we gained more and more consciousness and started to see how it could be possible. Our consciousness of the universe was increased sufficiently such that the doors to this possibility flung open. So something that seemed priorly impossible now seemed to be within possibility. To get to the moon, we needed to be conscious of the laws of gravity, because that's the first thing we need to overcome. Because at first, gravity seems like this thing that's just so difficult to overcome. It seems like this insurmountable barrier, and because of that, it makes it seem like we are stuck on this planet forever. But if we understand the laws of gravity deeply, we begin to realize that there is in fact a way to escape the planet. So when Newton codified his laws of gravity, it gave us a mathematical expression which told us exactly how much energy we would need in order to escape the force of gravity and go into orbit around the Earth. Consciousness of gravity gave us the means to overcome it. And we're also conscious of other very useful facts. For example, we're conscious of the fact that the Earth is round, which is not at all intuitive. But because we're conscious of that, we know that the Earth is spinning really fast, and it's spinning fastest near the equators. So we can launch ourselves more easily from a point near the equator, such as Florida, and use that additional velocity to get a speed boost. And this makes it more likely that an object we launch will reach the necessary escape velocity. Through science and experimentation, we gain even deeper insights, and we can test things like which is the best rocket fuel to use. Again, it's not just about developing theories, it's also about testing those theories and modifying them according to the results of experiments. And we can apply our theories and use math to figure out how much rocket fuel to use, for example. We might also want to experiment with different spaceship designs to see which functions best, as well as, training astronauts in order to equip them with the knowledge needed to survive in space. We then need to use our models of lunar orbits in order to know the precise trajectory of the moon and launch our spacecraft at exactly the right time. And here's something crucial, because our mathematical models give us a way to predict the future. We can know exactly where the moon is going to be 100 years from now. And being able to predict the future allows us to manipulate it. It allows us to plan ahead. And this is true of any predictive model, which gives you information about the future state of some system. Knowing the future state allows you to manipulate that future state in accordance with what you will. We should meditate upon this point because it's really profound, and one of the ways in which consciousness gives us a lot more free will. Humans have access to a lot of information, and we use this information to predict the future. So for example, we can use satellites to see the formation of hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean and then approximate the trajectory of those hurricanes. Doing so allows us to see the future and gives us the means to alter it. Previously, you wouldn't have known about a hurricane until the last minute, so before you would have been fated to just simply sit it out wherever you were. But being conscious of the fact that you're in the path of the storm allows you to do something about it. You can choose to evacuate, or you can choose to prepare. Because a lack of free will is often construed as being resigned to fate. But if you know your fate ahead of time, doesn't that give you the means to overcome it? Altering your fate in such a way is possible because of consciousness. If we can detect a meteor heading straight towards the Earth, you might have that sense that there's nothing we can do about it, so we should just do nothing. But being conscious of it and having more information about it and knowing exactly how far it is and how fast it's flying will give us some information we can work on to maybe prevent it. And if we all use our free will properly, we might be able to do something which otherwise seems impossible. And is this not exactly what free will is? Because, again, there's no guarantee that we'll stop the meteor, but there's nothing stopping us from trying, exerting our free will to try and alter our destinies, right? Now, let's go back to the NASA example for a moment, because we need to realize that the idea of going to the moon, before we actually accomplish it, is kind of like a metaphysical idea. It doesn't really exist, it just exists in our imagination. It's almost like a fantasy. But through our heightened consciousness, we're able to somehow turn this fantasy into reality. Again, if you're of the position that the psyche doesn't really exist, I hope this shows how ludicrous that is, because how is it possible that an imaginary thing can start to exist? The only logical conclusion is that the psyche does in and of itself exist in some capacity. It's not just an epiphenomenon. But before we actually end up going to the moon, it exists as this kind of possible future. And then we can select amongst many possible futures the one that we want. We want the future in which humankind ends up on the moon. And so something that was previously entirely a mental construct has become reality. Something that seems utterly insurmountable becomes achievable largely because of our consciousness. Now, is it merely being conscious of a fact which causes us to manipulate the world in accordance with our desires? i.e., is consciousness sufficient? Well, no, because just being conscious of something isn't usually enough. You need to actively manipulate your surroundings with persistent effort. And consciousness actually makes this more possible because consciousness includes being conscious of yourself. And that idea of yourself which you hold in your mind is something known as the ego. The ego is the part of your psyche which most people would identify as themselves. And I would argue that the ego itself comprises a kind of psychic complex which independently has free will compared to your unconscious. And your ego is an immensely powerful tool for achieving what you want. Arguably, the reason humans can focus so deliberately on very specific tasks is because of their egos. Your ego acts like the captain of your psyche and is able to direct your body in very specific ways in order to do very specific things. It allows you to hold ideas in mind as you pursue them. It allows you to filter your perceptions in order to very narrowly direct your attention on exactly what it is you want to get done. And it can also subdue the unconscious. So if you feel that craving for sugar come up from your unconscious mind, it's your ego which is capable of saying no to it. And the concentrated effort which the ego is capable of is a really key part of free will. People with very strong egos tend to be able to accomplish more because they have more free will. Things that are really difficult and require a lot of concentration don't just happen because the universe causes them to happen through pushing atoms around and then somehow it just spawns. Your psyche has to exert effort in order for difficult things to be accomplished. And your ego is a psychological apparatus which facilitates very deliberate action. And again, this is one of the reasons why humans have so much more free will than animals, is because we're ego-driven. Now, I want to consider the idea of invention as an example of how it is you can use your free will to get what you want. Because at first, an invention is like a metaphysical idea. It exists solely inside your mind. And there's no guarantee that it will actually manifest into reality. You have to be an active agent in bringing forth a future in which something which existed entirely inside your mind has now started to exist in reality. So a car was at one time a metaphysical idea, same with a computer, same with your toaster. All of these existed entirely inside the mind of somebody, but through their own free will, they were able to bring these things into existence. An invention doesn't start to exist because the universe just caused it to somehow exist. That would be absurd. You have to be an active agent in bringing it about. When you have an idea in your mind for a new invention or a new business or a creative endeavor like a screenplay or a musical work, your ego needs to hold that idea in mind as it manipulates your surroundings in order to generate that idea. And I really like the example of Shuji Nakamura, the guy who invented blue LEDs. I think a lot of people are familiar with this now thanks to the Veritasium video. But this was one of the most significant inventions of the 21st century, allowing you to watch this video that you're watching right now. The story of his grit and his determination, but also of his very deep consciousness of the physical and chemical properties of crystals, made it possible for him to invent the LED. So in multiple ways, his consciousness is what allowed this thing to start existing. So Nakamura had the desire to create a blue LED. So regardless of where this desire came from, his psyche had the desire within itself, and he was free to manifest this desire. But it seemed like the obstacles in his way were just totally insurmountable. Tons and tons of people were working on this project, and none of them were able to invent the blue LED. But somehow, through his insane work ethic and his determination, he was able to invent the blue LED. To do this, he needed to have a very deep understanding of the properties of semiconductors and how they could be used to generate light. This involves having consciousness of something which is very difficult to understand because you need to have a deep understanding of the molecular properties of certain crystals, in this case gallium nitride. So by studying this molecule at a theoretical and a practical level, which involved also experimenting with it, he was able to gain this deep insight. So his mind, wrapping itself around this very profound insight, gave him more free will to be able to bring that idea into fruition. And think about it, before his invention, this phenomenon never even occurred in the history of the universe. That's totally crazy to me. So Nakamura continuously supplied his consciousness with information which he needed in order to invent the blue LED. For most of human history, we weren't even aware of the fact that things were composed of protons, neutrons, and electrons. And now that we are conscious of these facts, look what it has enabled us to do. Nakamura's consciousness of the laws of electricity and the properties of chemical structures were necessary components in allowing him to bring forth this invention. Again, it's the state of his psyche which is responsible for it. It's not just matter pushing matter which caused him to invent the blue LED. I find that to be a completely absurd proposition. And he could supply his consciousness with more information. For example, he could perform experiments to get more information about the properties of the chemicals that he was working with, which is why he deliberately experimented a lot. So trial and error was a major part of his process. But additionally, he was also very proficient with his hands, and he deeply understood the machine that he was working with because he assembled it himself. By directly working with the machine, he was conscious of its inner workings, and this gave him an advantage because it allowed him to customize his machine however he wished. This is why, for example, if your car breaks down, being conscious of how car engines works gives you more free will to be able to fix it. Without this knowledge, you're going to have to hire somebody else who does have this knowledge within their consciousness. Nakamura's knowledge of this machine gave him more power to manipulate it, allowing him to create a version of the machine which could synthesize the crystals that he needed. And it wasn't just his intelligence, it wasn't just the fact that his mind understood these very deep concepts, it was his persistence and his effort and his determination. He wanted to invent the blue LED so badly that he overcame so many obstacles that were hindering him. Sometimes when people encounter so many obstacles to that which they pursue, they just give up because they don't want to deal with all those obstacles. But every time he encountered one, he forced his way through it. Furthermore, he constantly failed because every time he would try to make a crystal, most of the time it wouldn't work out the way he wanted. Sometimes when people fail over and over again, they give up. But being persistent and learning from failures actually gives you even more free will to overcome the obstacles that are in your path. And so what's really important here is having a strong ego. Single-mindedly focused on a task gives you a greater chance of success. Nakamura imposed upon himself a very strict work ethic. His schedule was insane. I don't think he took any weekends off. And only an ego can obey an imposed schedule. Because in a sense, a schedule is also a metaphysical idea. It's something which you imagine and your ego can choose to conform to it. It's in that sense similar to a moral belief. And so in some sense, you should really think of the schedule as being a part of his psyche, a part of his ego. It comprises a part of the entity which has free will over his body, and his body conforms to that schedule, to that higher or metaphysical idea. This level of grit and determination is something which only a strong ego is capable of. So could something like this even be possible without the idea of free will? Because again, if you assume that free will doesn't exist, you're explaining this in terms of just atoms pushing atoms, and that's all it is. This guy invented something which literally seemed impossible to invent because atoms were pushing other atoms and it caused the invention to come about. Clearly that's false. Clearly parts of his psyche, his grit, his determination, his consciousness of these very difficult to understand facts, those were all important in causing this invention to start existing. Because prior to their invention, blue LEDs only existed inside the mind as something theoretical. And so if you ignore the existence of the mind, it doesn't really make sense how a blue LED could start to exist. The existence of this psyche is a critical component in this. Solely referring to physical causation is insufficient for explaining this phenomenon. Or you may be thinking something like, well, he didn't choose to want the blue LED. Maybe it was something that his boss ordered him to do. So in that sense, he's not free. But I would say that even if he didn't choose to want it, that desire became a part of his psyche, and it was his psyche that had the free will to pursue it. It didn't just happen to happen. His psyche needed to exert its free will in order for it to happen. There's no other way to make sense of this. Free will is always talked about in very simplistic decisions where you have to pick one flavor of ice cream over another. It's rarely discussed with respect to complex human behavior, such as inventing new technology. Now, having discussed the connection between consciousness and free will, I want to discuss some of the implications of this fact, because it implies that more education can actually increase your free will. Because the act of education is supplying your consciousness with more information with respect to certain things. So this means that education should increase your free will with respect to certain tasks. And I think this is rather obvious, no? Isn't it generally true that more educated people are capable of doing more than uneducated people? For which reason educated people are often wealthier and have higher paying jobs? Now, obviously this is context dependent. It depends on what we're trying to do. So a poor person might be better at fishing, for example, if that's their vocation. But in general, education increases the amount of free will you have with respect to certain things. For example, imagine two individuals. One is a carpenter and one is an accountant. And I asked both of them to construct a wooden table. Are they both equally free to do this? Well, I would argue that the carpenter is actually more free to do this because his consciousness is supplied with more information with respect to that task, and so he has to overcome less barriers to be able to do that. The accountant, on the other hand, will have much more barriers to have to deal with, decreasing the odds of him actually successfully accomplishing that. And what if I asked both of them to balance a company's financial records, or whatever it is that accountants do? Who has more free will now? Well, presumably the accountant, for the same reason, right? His consciousness is in a state where it has more information with respect to the task, making it much easier for him to do it. So if you're ever in a situation where you're incapable of doing something, a good solution might be to simply become more educated about it. Education has the potential to supply your consciousness with more information with respect to the task, giving you more power to be able to do it. So for example, as a fun project, I've been recently designing my own calculator. And to do so, I've had to learn about electronics and circuits and logic. And so the likelihood of me doing this has increased as a result of me increasing my consciousness about the topic. And you might be thinking to yourself that if you wanted to do something in an area in which you're not educated, you can just use the internet to become educated about it. And this is exactly why the internet is such a powerful tool and why the internet gives you even more free will. It has the potential to increase your free will because you can become educated about any subject through the internet. So these days, if you want to fix your car engine, it's completely possible because you can just find a YouTube video that explains it. So the big picture idea here is that if you're conscious of something, you've potentially increased your free will with respect to it. And this even includes yourself or other aspects of your psyche. I study depth psychology. In fact, it's like the main thing I talk about on this channel. And so consciousness is a very important tool that I use in order to give people insights into things which may otherwise be sapping their free will. And this includes other parts of your own psyche. Think back to that example with the sugar that I mentioned before. We generally call these other aspects of your psyche complexes. And in a sense, each complex has its own free will. It has its own desires and its own attempts to control your body in accordance with those desires. And these can potentially sap your free will if they're trying to push you in another direction. But we've already said that it's the psyche which gives you free will. So you might be thinking, how is it possible that your psyche can both give you free will and be the thing that takes away your free will? This is something which I'll discuss more thoroughly in the future, but basically, each part of your psyche should be thought of as having its own free will, and it's possible that the free will of one part of your psyche conflicts with the free will of another part of your psyche. And so that part of your psyche forms a kind of barrier to getting what the other part wants. And for one part of your psyche to exert its free will might potentially entail overcoming that other part of your psyche and subduing it. So for example, if you have a complex which makes you untrusting of other people, but you want to become more trusting and open with other people, being conscious of this complex within yourself is the first step to overcoming it. If you become aware of this side of yourself, for example, if you examine your past and learn about, for example, traumatic events in your childhood which caused you to be untrusting, you've gained some measure of free will to be able to redirect your destiny. Whereas previously you would have been fated by your circumstances, you now have some measure to choose otherwise. So the connection between consciousness and free will is a very important fact to develop in the field of personality development. Okay, so let's finally get axiomatic and summarize what we've said. Let's define what we mean by consciousness. Consciousness is the psychic experience of awareness, explicit knowledge, and structured encoding of information, leading to a generalized understanding of concepts and the environment. Now we're going to want to say how consciousness increases our ability to do things. Consciousness, as a psychic experience involving awareness and explicit knowledge, not only provides access to information, but also encodes and structures information more efficiently than raw perceptions. This structured encoding allows for a generalized understanding of concepts and causal relationships, enhancing the capacity of individuals to perform tasks effectively and exert influence over their environment. Another important thing that we're going to want to capture is that idea that I mentioned with respect to models that allow us to predict the future and how these can give us even more free will if we're conscious of the results of those models, i.e. how knowing the future state through a predictive model gives us the ability to alter the future. Consciousness includes the capacity to be aware of predictive models and potential future states, allowing individuals to predict the future and take intentional actions that can influence or alter the course of events. Another really important idea is the fact that consciousness can be used to hold on to the metaphysical ideas which you generate with your mind, and by holding on to these ideas, you can manipulate your surroundings in order to bring those ideas forth. Consciousness has the capacity to hold imaginary constructs and ideas in mind, and through focused pursuit and action, can influence the manifestation of those ideas into reality. Now we're going to want to capture what we discussed about the ego and the fact that your ego can allow you to very deliberately concentrate on things. Consciousness is closely tied to the presence of an ego or sense of self, which directs and focuses the conscious mind towards specific objects or goals. The ego enables individuals to mobilize their entire cognitive and physical resources with concentrated effort towards achieving desired outcomes. So these axioms show the relationship between consciousness and our capacity to get what we desire. Consciousness greatly expands the number of things over which we potentially have free will. And the ego forms a specific part of our minds which, through consciousness, allows us to narrowly focus on specific tasks, which makes it even more likely that we'll bring them forth. So this concludes this video, and in the next video, I'm going to be discussing the idea of determinism and why determinism is often presented as a fact which contradicts free will. But what I'm going to be showing is that I believe that a lot of these arguments are flawed based on what we've said so far, and I also want to show that even if some of the arguments with respect to determinism are valid, they don't necessarily imply the conclusion that free will therefore doesn't exist. In fact, I think it's the opposite. The fact that determinism is a thing actually gives us more free will, especially if we're conscious of deterministic laws. So yeah, in the next video, I'll be debunking causal determinism as a contradiction of free will. But anyways, thanks so much for watching, have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.